Whatever storm was gathering, whatever shadows stalked their steps, she knew he would stand against it. But even the strongest cowboy couldn't fight what he didn't know. By sundown, the air grew thick again, heavy with the scent of rain, though the sky held no clouds. He saddled his horse and told her he needed to ride out to the hills. She wanted to beg him not to remind him that the shot had come from there, but she saw the resolve in his eyes. He wasn't a man who ran from danger. He was a man who rode straight toward it. She stood on the porch as he mounted up, her hands gripping the railing until her knuckles ached. He gave her one last look, tipping his hat, a silent promise resting in his gaze. Then he rode off into the deepening twilight, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. The wind rose, whistling through the dry grass, and the night seemed to close in around her. She waited, staring at the hills, knowing that whatever waited out there would change everything. She didn't know if he would return with answers, or if the land would swallow him whole before the truth was found. All she knew was that the story of their love had only just begun, and the first battle to keep it had already arrived. And as darkness settled, a lantern flickered in the far distance, just beyond the ridge, swaying as though carried by unseen hands. She gasped, clutching her chest. He hadn't reached that ridge yet. Whoever held that light wasn't him. Someone else was out there waiting. The lantern swayed in the distance, its glow bobbing like a lone firefly caught in the dark. She pressed her hand against her chest, her breath catching as fear crawled along her spine. Whoever held that light knew exactly what they were doing. It was not an accident. Out on that ridge, no man walked at night without purpose. She wanted to call out, to warn him before he rode straight into danger, but her voice failed her. The sound of hooves had long since faded, and he was too far to hear. All she could do was stand frozen on the porch, her eyes fixed on the flicker of light that promised nothing good. The night dragged slowly, every second stretched thin, and she found herself pacing the small house. She checked the windows, bolted the door, then checked again, as if wood and iron could stop whatever evil might be out there. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits. She sat by the window with her hands trembling in her lap, waiting for the sound of hooves to return. But the silence grew heavier, pressing down until she could hardly breathe. The main road into town wasn't far, and her thoughts kept wandering there. The saloon would be alive with voices and smoke, men playing cards under the oil lamps, laughter that covered the lies and grudges sitting just beneath the surface. Somewhere in that mix of voices were the same men who envied the cowboy. Some had lost cattle in disputes over land, others hated the way he had built his fortune without begging favors. She imagined them talking in hushed tones, mugs slamming against the tables, making plans while the piano played to drown their words. It was too easy to picture one of them walking out, rifle slung over the shoulder, heading toward the ridge with a grin that promised trouble. But there were other whispers too, ones tied to her own past. The town didn't know her story, but secrets never stayed buried for long. A stranger asking the wrong questions, a letter carried by a rider or a bounty, whispered across state lines, could have been enough. She had run far, but running didn't erase the memory of those she had escaped. The men she once feared had a way of sniffing out weakness, and if they had followed her trail here, then both she and the cowboy were caught in a storm that had been building long before that first rifle crack. While the main conflict pressed against the edges of her world, smaller troubles weaved themselves through the threads of their lives. 8. The ranch hands, loyal as they were, had started to notice the tension. A few muttered under their breath when they thought no one was listening, wondering if staying on his payroll might draw them into a feud that wasn't theirs. One older hand, a man with lines carved deep into his face from years under the sun, had warned her quietly when she passed him in the yard. He told her that cattle rustlers didn't fire warning shots. They took what they wanted and left bodies behind. That meant this was something else, something darker. She carried his words with her, each one like a stone in her pocket. At the same time, the town's mood was shifting. She had felt it earlier that week when she walked into the general store. The shopkeeper's wife, usually kind enough to greet her, had avoided her eyes. A group of women by the shelves whispered with their heads bent close, falling silent the moment she neared. The air around her was heavy with judgment, as though by standing at the cowboy's side she had stolen something that didn't belong to her. Envy had always been sharp in this town, and now it seemed aimed directly at her. She wondered if their jealousy might be fueling something larger, feeding the men who lurked in the hills. The sun rose slowly the next morning, stretching pale light over the plains. She had hardly slept when she heard the steady thud of hooves returning. Rushing to the porch, her heart leaped when she saw him riding back. Dust clung to his coat, his hat low over his brow, his jaw set hard. Relief swept through her, but it was short-lived. There was no ease in his shoulders, no warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. Something had happened out there on the ridge, and whatever it was, it hadn't brought him peace. He dismounted without a word, tying his horse to the post with more force than was needed. She waited, but silence hung between them like a wall. Finally, when he stepped onto the porch, she asked softly, "Did you find anything?" Eyes flicked toward the horizon before meeting hers. "Tracks," he said, his voice rough. "2 men, maybe more. They weren't hiding. They wanted me to see them." Her stomach tightened. Why would they do that? He shook his head, pulling off his gloves. "To show me they're watching. It's to remind me this isn't over." The words sank into her chest, heavy and cold. Whoever was out there wasn't looking for a quick strike. They were playing a longer game, testing his patience, waiting for him to slip. That meant the danger wasn't passing, it was settling in, circling like wolves that had caught the scent of blood. The days that followed were filled with uneasy quiet. The ranch hands worked, but with nervous glances toward the hills. The cattle stirred at night, restless, as though they too sensed the threat. Even the air seemed different, sharper, carrying the weight of something unseen. The cowboy rode out each morning, checking fences, scanning the ridges, never saying much. She watched him from the porch, the sight of his figure against the open land both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because he stood unshaken, terrifying because she knew he was riding toward danger each time. Yet beneath the larger threat, other troubles began to stir. Supplies ordered from town were delayed, and when they arrived, they were short of what was promised. The blacksmith, once eager to do business with him, suddenly refused to sharpen his tools. The saloon, which had always been a neutral ground, now seemed colder when he stepped through its doors. These weren't accidents. They were signs that the town itself was being pulled into the conflict, piece by piece. Someone was working behind the scenes, poisoning the well of loyalty, turning allies into strangers. One evening, she overheard 2 ranch hands talking outside the barn. They thought she couldn't hear, but their words carried through the still night air. One said he had heard whispers in town that men were being paid to keep watch on the cowboys' land. The other claimed a deal was being struck to buy up pieces of property around them, cutting off access to the water that kept their cattle alive. These weren't just threats, they were strategies. Someone wanted to bleed the ranch dry, and the rifle crack had only been the beginning. She felt the weight of her silence pressing down harder each day. The secrets she carried were tied too closely to the danger at hand. Each time she looked into his eyes, she wanted to tell him the truth, to lay bare the fear she had run from. But the words caught in her throat. She was afraid of what he might think, afraid he might see her as a burden instead of a partner. And yet, keeping it from him was its own kind of betrayal. The conflict wasn't just out on the hills. It was here, between them, in the spaces where trust should have filled. He carried his burden alone, and she carried hers in silence. Both were strong, but strength alone couldn't hold back a storm forever. One night, as she sat awake listening to the restless groan of the wind, a shadow moved across the yard. Her heart leaped into her throat. She pressed her face against the window, her eyes straining against the dark. A figure stood near the barn, tall, unmoving. For a moment she thought it might be him, but his horse was still tied to the post. Whoever stood out there was not her cowboy. The figure turned slowly, as if knowing she was watching, and lifted a hand in a gesture that was not a wave, but a warning. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the shadow slipped back into the dark, leaving her trembling in the silence. When she told him the next morning, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. He didn't call her mistaken. He didn't say it was imagination. He knew. The threat had come closer now, no longer hiding in the hills, but standing on their land. The tension around them was no longer just whispers or warnings. It had rooted itself deep in the soil of the ranch, and every step, every breath, felt heavy with its presence. She knew the storm was only beginning, and whatever came next would test not only their courage, but the bond that held them together. The light of day no longer felt safe. The night stretched long, filled with shadows that waited just beyond the porch. The nights grew longer, heavier, each one pressing down with the weight of what was waiting out there beyond the ridge. The figure she had seen by the barn haunted her mind. Every creak of the house seemed louder now. Every gust of wind carried whispers of danger. The cowboy said little, but she saw the way his eyes narrowed at the horizon, how his hand rested on his revolver, even when he was just sitting at the table. He was a man used to storms, but this one was different. This one felt personal. The ranch had taken on a silence that wasn't natural. The cattle were restless, shifting at night, as though they too sensed the eyes watching from the hills. The ranch hands spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the shadows more than they looked at their work. A few had already left, claiming family matters in nearby towns, but she knew the truth. Fear had driven them off, and who could blame them? A ranch was land and cattle, but without men to guard it, it was an open door to anyone bold enough to take it. The saloon in town grew louder with rumors. He had ridden in one afternoon, needing supplies, and returned with his jaw set tighter than before. She asked him what was said, but he only shook his head, refusing to burden her with it. She caught enough in his silence to know. Folks were saying the ranch was cursed, that his wealth had been stolen from others, that he was losing control of what he had built. Lies spread faster than wildfire, and someone was feeding them. Whoever their enemy was, they weren't only firing shots in the dark. They were poisoning every well of trust he had. She tried to keep the house steady, to make sure meals were warm and the fire never went out, but she felt the walls closing in. Each night she sat by the window, staring into the dark until her eyes burned. More than once, she thought she saw movement in the distance, shadows shifting against the faint glow of the moon. Once, she swore she heard footsteps on the porch, slow and careful before fading away again. When she told him, his face hardened. He didn't call her mistaken, simply loaded another round into his rifle and leaned it by the door. But beneath the tension of the ranch, another conflict was tightening its grip inside her. She had carried her secret for so long, burying the past she had run from. Yet each day that passed, it weighed heavier on her chest. If the men she feared were the same ones lurking in the hills, then she was the reason this danger had come. The cowboy didn't know. He thought this fight was his alone, born of jealousy and greed. She wanted to tell him the truth, to lay bare that the night had settled over the wide plains, wrapping the land in a quiet that only the prairie knew. The moonlight stretched across the open range, spilling silver over the grass that swayed in the dry wind. Far in the distance, a lone coyote's cry cut through the silence. But the ranch house stood tall and steady against the dark horizon, its lantern glowing like a beacon. Inside, the air was heavy with something unspoken, a story ready to be told, a promise waiting to break free. Life out here was never gentle, but the land bred men who carried themselves with pride, and women whose hearts beat with equal strength. The West wasn't a place for the weak. It was for those who dared to fight for what they wanted, and for those willing to risk everything when the world tried to take it away. She had come to this land with nothing but a hope in her chest. Her eyes had once carried the innocence of someone untouched by the hardships of life, but long days under the sun and longer nights of fear had carved out a quiet strength inside her. The town whispered about her when she passed, some out of envy, others out of spite. But she walked with her head lifted, the way only someone who had suffered enough to stop caring about gossip could. Yet when she looked out at the endless fields, a part of her still longed for safety, for someone to look at her not as a burden or a prize, but as a soul worth keeping. The cowboy had been watching from the distance long before fate threw their paths together. He was a man carved from the land itself, broad-shouldered, with eyes that reflected the same restless sky he rode beneath. Folks in town called him rich because he had acres stretching farther than most men could ride in a day, but his wealth wasn't in gold or silver. It was in the cattle that grazed under his brand, in the soil that turned fertile beneath his boots, and in the way men tipped their hats when he walked by. He wasn't the kind of man who chased after hearts. He was the kind of man women whispered about when they thought no one could hear. The night they first spoke, there was no music playing, no crowd watching, no stars promising magic. Just a quiet porch, the hum of crickets, and the weight of words that seemed too heavy to speak. I had been trembling, her breath unsteady, though not from fear of him. He had leaned against the wooden post, arms crossed, a half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he had seen through every wall she tried to build. His silence was not empty. It was a steady kind of patience, the sort that told her he would wait as long as it took for her to speak. Her voice broke the stillness when she whispered the words she never thought she'd say. There was no trembling plea in them, no weakness. Only a fragile honesty that struck deeper than thunder. And when his smile followed, it wasn't the smile of a man amused. It was the smile of a man who knew he had been chosen. That night didn't end in fireworks or promises carved into stone, but something had shifted. Something that would not shift back. Life in the West was rarely kind to love. The land demanded too much. Cattle drives stretched for weeks, storms could tear down barns, and bandits never slept for long. Trust was harder to build than fences, and hearts broke easier than bones. Yet in that moment between them, there was no storm, no danger, no burden. Only the quiet certainty that the ground beneath their boots had changed. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and he had made a vow without speaking a word. The days that followed carried the same rhythm of ranch life. Sun up, chores done, sweat burning against skin until the air cooled with dusk. But beneath the ordinary, something electric lingered. The ranch hands noticed the way he looked toward the porch more often than the herds. The townfolk noticed how she carried herself with a new kind of fire, no longer weighed by loneliness. It was in the glances they shared, the silence that spoke louder than words, and the unspoken bond neither dared to name aloud. But with every whisper of love on the wind, there came shadows too. Not everyone wanted to see her find peace, and not everyone was willing to see him keep what others thought he didn't deserve. Old grudges from rival ranchers, jealousy from those who had wanted her for themselves, and the quiet cruelty of a town that thrived on tearing apart what it couldn't understand. Trouble was brewing on the horizon, the kind that tested more than land and cattle, kind that tested loyalty, faith, and the strength of promises never spoken. She felt it before it came, the way one can feel the storm long before the first lightning strike. There were nights she sat at the window, her hands gripping the curtain, her eyes watching the fields for a sign of movement. He would find her there sometimes, her worry written plain across her face. Though he said little, the way his hand settled on her shoulder told her enough. He wasn't a man who offered flowery words. He was a man who protected what was his, and she knew in her heart he would do the same for her. Still, love in the West came at a price. Every step toward him meant another step away from safety, away from the chance to hide. She wasn't just choosing a man. She was choosing the life that came with him, life of dust and danger, of wealth that drew envy and loyalty that drew enemies. Yet she knew there was no turning back. The path was set, and though fear tightened her chest at night, the thought of losing him was worse than any danger the land could bring. One evening, as the sky burned in streaks of crimson and gold, he rode back from the far fields, his hat low over his brow, his horse carrying the dust of miles behind it. She stood waiting, the wind tugging at her dress, her heart beating faster with every step he took toward her. When his boots hit the porch, the air seemed to thicken, the world narrowing to the two of them. She wanted to speak, to tell him the truth that had been burning inside her. But before her lips parted, he tilted his head, that same quiet smile playing at his mouth. And then, as the night drew close around them, a sound shattered the calm. The distant crack of a rifle echoed from the hills. He stiffened, his hand instinctively going to his side. She gasped, her eyes darting toward the horizon. The silence of the land had broken, and with it, the fragile safety they had found. Somewhere out there, someone had decided to challenge what they had built. The wind carried the echo long after the shot had faded, leaving the night tense, unfinished, heavy with questions. She gripped his arm, her voice barely more than a whisper, trembling with fear and love together. And though he did not speak, his eyes told her what she already knew. Their story had only just begun, and the fight to keep it had arrived sooner than either of them expected. Would the cowboy's strength be enough to hold onto her against a world that wanted to tear them apart? Or would the land claim another love too fragile to withstand its storms? The answer lay just beyond the shadows of the coming night, waiting to be revealed. The crack of the rifle still seemed to hang in the air, as if the hills themselves were holding their breath. She clung to his arm, her heart hammering against her ribs, every shadow on the horizon turning into a threat. He stood still, shoulders squared, his eyes sharp as steel as he scanned the fields. The night was quiet again, but it was not the same kind of quiet they had known before. This one was heavy, dangerous, full of unseen eyes watching from the dark. He didn't speak, not right away. He only placed a steady hand over hers, pulling her closer as though his touch alone could shield her. Then, with a slow calm that came only from years of facing storms head-on, he told her to lock the door and stay inside. His voice was low, even yet it carried the weight of command. She wanted to argue, to tell him she wasn't the sort of woman who hid when danger came calling, but the look in his eyes stilled her tongue. He wasn't asking, he was making sure she would be safe. When he stepped down from the porch and crossed the yard, the sound of his boots striking the dirt echoed in her chest. She pressed her hand to the wooden frame of the door, watching until the night swallowed him whole. The lantern inside the house flickered against the walls, but she kept her gaze fixed outside, waiting, praying that he would come back the same way he had gone. The town had long whispered that the cowboy's land was a prize worth fighting for. With his herds fattening on good grass and his barns standing tall, envy had grown like weeds among neighbors who didn't have half as much. And envy turned to bitterness when he refused to bow to anyone's pressure. He wasn't the kind of man to give up water rights or grazing space. He stood firm, and because of it, he had earned both respect and enemies. Now, with her under his roof, the whispers had grown louder. Some said she had chosen him for his wealth. Others claimed he had taken her in for reasons far from love. Neither truth nor lie mattered to those who wanted to see them torn apart. She thought back to the weeks before she found herself at his ranch. The town hadn't been kind to her. Every step she took on its wooden sidewalks had been followed by stares. Every word she spoke weighed and measured. She was the outsider, the woman who came from nowhere, carrying secrets in her eyes. She had worked where she could, cleaning, cooking, stitching torn cloth for ranch hands who tossed her coins as though doing her a favor. But none of it gave her safety. She lived in the shadow of fear, knowing that men who saw her alone thought she could be claimed. That was before the cowboy. He had seen her in a way no one else had, not as a burden, not as a prize, but as someone with a spirit worth protecting. He never asked about her past, though she sometimes caught him studying her as if he wanted to. Perhaps he knew that her story wasn't one she was ready to tell. Or perhaps he simply understood that a person's worth wasn't tied to what they had run from. Still, his quiet patience was a shelter, and it was why her heart had given itself to him so quickly, so completely. But now, as the wind picked up and rattled the windows, she wondered if her past had somehow followed her here. Was the rifle's crack a warning meant for him? Or was it meant for her? She hugged herself, the question swirling inside her mind. She had never spoken of the men she had fled from, men whose hands were as rough as their words, men who believed a woman's fear was their right to own. She had crossed rivers, walked miles, and left behind everything to be free of them. Yet freedom was never guaranteed. Outside, his horse whinnied, restless against the shifting shadows. He reappeared at the edge of the yard, walking slow, scanning the tree line. His hat was tilted back now, his jaw tight. When he stepped onto the porch, he didn't speak at first. He brushed the dust from his gloves, glanced toward the hills again, and then looked at her with eyes that held more than words. She opened the door, her breath catching, but he shook his head. "Not tonight," he said quietly. "They wanted us to hear it, not feel it. The weight." She swallowed hard, her body still trembling. Who would do this? She asked, though part of her already knew. His silence was answer enough. Enemies weren't always strangers. Sometimes they were men who had once shaken his hand, men who had once raised a glass in his name at the saloon. Jealousy twisted neighbors into foes quicker than the wind could shift on the plains. He didn't have to say the names aloud. She could see them written in his tightened brow, hear them in the firmness of his tone. That night, she barely slept. Each creak of the house, each howl of the wind set her heart racing. He lay awake too, though he tried to hide it. His hand rested on the edge of the bed, near where his rifle leaned against the wall. The glow of the dying fire cast shadows across his face, carving him into the image of every protector she had ever dreamed of, and yet she knew the weight he carried was heavier than any bullet. He wasn't just guarding the ranch or the cattle. He was guarding her. Morning came with the sky painted in gold and rose. The ranch hands moved about the yard, unaware of the shot fired in the dark. He told them nothing, only gave orders sharper than usual, sending them to mend fences and ride the far line of the property. His voice was steady, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. the way his hand lingered on the revolver at his side longer than before. She busied herself in the kitchen, but her thoughts were far from the bread baking in the oven. Every face in town flashed through her mind. The storekeeper who looked at her with pity. The rancher's widow who glared each time she passed. The young men who laughed too loud when she walked by. Any of them could have reason to see her gone. Or maybe the danger wasn't about her at all. Or maybe it was only him, the man who had stood strong against every threat until now. Yet deep inside, she feared the truth was more tangled. What if her past and his present had collided? What if the men she had escaped had found her, waiting for the right time to strike? The thought made her knees weak, but she bit it back. Telling him would mean telling him everything, laying bare the pieces of her history she had tried so hard to bury. She wasn't ready for that, not yet. Still, she couldn't shake the memory of his smile that first night, the way it had told her without words that she was safe in his world. She held on to that memory like a lantern in the dark. Shadows that chased her here, but fear of losing him sealed her lips. What if he looked at her differently? What if he thought she had brought ruin upon his land? Love made her brave, but shame made her silent. One evening, as the sky bled into shades of red and gold, the first real strike came. A barn door left open when it shouldn't have been. Cattle gone. Hoofprints leading off into the brush, too many for one man to have taken alone. He rode hard after them with two of his hands, but by the time they found the trail, it was cold. The cattle were gone, driven into the hills, and whoever had taken them left no sign of where they'd gone. When he returned, fury burned in his eyes, though his voice was calm when he spoke. "This isn't about the cattle," he said, setting his hat on the table. "This is about me." She sat across from him, her hands trembling against her lap. She wanted to speak, to tell him that it wasn't just about him, but the words stuck. He had given her shelter, safety, and a place in his world. She couldn't bring herself to confess that the danger might be hers as much as his. So she said nothing, and the silence between them grew heavier than the storm outside. The next night, fire lit up the sky. One of the storage sheds at the far edge of the property went up in flames. By the time the ranch hands reached it, the blaze had already eaten through the roof, spilling sparks into the dark. He fought the fire himself, his face blackened with smoke, his hands blistered by the heat. She stood back, helpless, the glow of the flames painting the land in violent shades of orange. When the fire finally died, there was nothing left but ashes. Whoever had lit it wanted him to know they could strike whenever they pleased. The attacks grew bolder after that. Tools went missing. Horses were spooked in the night, their screams tearing through the stillness. Once she woke to find the gate to the corral wide open, though she swore she had seen him close it with his own hands. It was as if their enemy was always one step ahead, always watching, always ready to tear at the seams of what little peace remained. In town, the whispers grew sharper. He was losing his grip. His ranch was crumbling. His woman was a curse. She heard it all when she walked through the streets, heads turning, eyes following her with judgment. She held her chin high, but inside her heart was breaking. Every cruel word felt like a stone thrown at her, and still she kept her silence. One night, after days of unrest, she found him sitting on the porch, long after the lamps had burned low. His rifle rested across his knees, his hat tilted forward, but she knew he wasn't asleep. She stepped quietly toward him, and though he didn't look up, his voice cut through the dark. "They won't stop," he said. "Not until they think they've taken everything from me." Her breath caught, the urge to confess burning inside her chest. "What if it isn't just you they're after?" she asked, her voice trembling. He lifted his head then, his eyes catching the faint light of the stars. For a moment she thought he knew, that he had already pieced it together. But he only shook his head, his jaw tight. "Then they'll learn soon enough that I don't let go of what's mine." The words should have comforted her, but they only deepened her fear. He thought this was his fight alone. He didn't know the full weight of the storm. And the longer she stayed silent, the more she feared that, when the truth came, it would break them both. Days passed, and each one brought them closer to the breaking point. The ranch was stretched thin. Men were leaving. Supplies were harder to come by. The enemy wasn't just at the gates, they were inside, tightening the noose one quiet step at a time. Then came the letter. Delivered by a rider who said nothing, just left it at the edge of the porch before riding off into the dust. She found it first, the paper folded, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside were only a few words, scrawled in a hand she recognized all too well. Words that made her blood run cold, words that told her the past she had fled had finally caught up. She shoved the letter into her apron, hiding it before he could see. Her secret was no longer a shadow. It was here, written in ink, threatening to tear apart the life they had built. She should have told him then, should have handed him the truth before it grew any heavier. But when he came through the door, his face streaked with dust and weariness, she couldn't do it. She folded her silence around her like armor, though she knew it was only a matter of time before it shattered. The nights turned darker still. Shots fired in the distance became more frequent. Lights flickered on the ridge, lanterns moving where no man had a right to be. And through it all, the letter burned in her pocket, a secret waiting to explode. She knew the climax was coming, the moment where everything would collide as enemies, her past, the storm that had been gathering for too long. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. The cattle stirred, the wind howled, and the house creaked under the weight of a fight neither of them could avoid. The question wasn't if the storm would break, it was when. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The storm finally passed, leaving the land quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. The dark clouds moved east, and the first rays of sun touched the wet earth, glistening on the grass and the wooden posts that lined the ranch fence. It had been a long night, one that had tested courage, loyalty, and the very meaning of love. He stood at the porch, his broad shoulders slumped, but his spirit still strong, watching the world return to calm. The cattle were safe, the men were tired, and the ranch still stood. Yet what weighed most on his heart was not the damage the storm had left behind, but the woman inside the house whose voice had changed his life forever. She sat by the window, her hands folded on her lap, watching him with quiet eyes. She remembered the first time she had whispered to him in that fragile, trembling tone, not knowing what tomorrow would bring, not knowing if she could trust a man like him. But time had revealed more than just his strength. It showed his patience, his gentleness, and the way he carried burdens that would have broken others. He was a cowboy, but not like the kind in the stories where pride came before everything. He had learned that true power was in choosing kindness, even when the world gave reasons for bitterness. The ranch had been more than a home for her. It had become a place where she had learned what family truly meant. The men working alongside him had taken her in as if she had always been a part of their lives. Each morning when the rooster crowed and the sky blushed pink, she saw them ride out together, their trust in one another unshakable. She saw him lead not with harsh words but with example, and she knew why they followed him. It was the same reason her heart had followed too, even when she tried to hold it back. Still, questions lingered like dust in the air after a herd passed through. The dangers that had circled them had not vanished overnight. Greed still lurked in town, men with restless eyes still whispered of taking what was not theirs, and the quiet rivalry that had nearly broken them still smoldered beneath the surface. But she had found something worth holding on to, something that gave her strength to face whatever came. She had found him, and he, for all his silence and long hours under the sky, had found her too. He stepped inside, boots heavy with mud, hat tipped low. The smell of rain followed him, mixed with the leather of his coat. He looked at her, and in that one look she felt the warmth of promises not spoken but deeply meant. Hay sat down across from her, resting his hands on the table, scarred and rough but steady. For a long while they said nothing, letting the quiet between them speak. It was a quiet filled with trust, with the memory of the nights they had survived and the mornings they had greeted together. "I thought we might lose it all," he finally said, his voice low but steady. The storm, the fire, the men in town who wanted this place. It felt like everything was pressing down at once. She reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "But we didn't lose it. We still have this land, this home. We still have each other." Her words carried a strength he hadn't realized she possessed. For so long he had been the protector, the one to shield, to guard, to keep the weight of the world on his shoulders. Now he saw her not as someone who needed saving, but as someone who had chosen to stand beside him, ready to fight whatever came. That changed everything. The days that followed were not easy, but they were steady. Together they rebuilt what had been broken, mended fences, tended the herd, and faced the men who had once been enemies. Slowly, the ranch grew strong again, its heartbeat steady as the seasons turned. And through it all, their bond only deepened, shaped by struggle, but also by small, ordinary moments that held more power than grand gestures ever could. The way she handed him his coffee in the morning, the way he checked the doors at night to make sure she felt safe, the way they walked the land together, hand in hand, watching the sun set across the wide sky. One evening, as the cicadas sang and the stars scattered across the heavens, she whispered the same words she had once spoken in fear, but now with a quiet joy. "Lay me down, cowboy." Her voice was no longer uncertain, it was steady, filled with the knowledge of love that had been tested and proven true. He smiled, not with triumph, but with gratitude, because he understood what it meant. It meant she had chosen this life, chosen him, and chosen to make her place here forever. The town soon began to change its tune as well. The same folks who had once doubted now tipped their hats when they passed. They saw how the ranch had not only survived but thrived, how the cowboy and the woman at his side carried themselves with honor. It wasn't wealth that earned their respect, though the ranch grew richer with time. It was the way they lived, honest and unshaken, building something that could not be bought or stolen. The younger ranch hands often told stories by the fire. Tales of how the boss had stood tall against every storm, every rival, every test. But when asked what made him strongest, they always looked toward the porch where she often stood, her hair touched by the glow of lantern light. They knew the truth: he was strong because he had found someone worth being strong for. Years passed, but the memory of that storm, that night when everything seemed ready to collapse, never faded. It became the measure of their resilience, a reminder that when all felt lost, they had chosen to hold on tighter, not let go. And whenever doubts returned, as they sometimes did, they would sit together in the quiet and remember how far they had come. In the end, it wasn't the wealth of the ranch or the cattle on the land that mattered most. It wasn't even the respect they had earned, or the rivals they had outlasted. What mattered was the life they built together, a life carved out of hard work, trust, and love that had begun with a whisper and grown into something unbreakable. She leaned against him one night as the fire crackled, her head resting on his shoulder, and he looked down at her with that same smile he had given her long ago. A smile that told her she would never be alone again. And she knew in her heart that whatever storms still came, whatever shadows still tried to fall across their path, they would face them together. Because once she had whispered to him in fear, but now she lived with him in strength. And that made all the difference. The cowboy kept her, not in chains, not in duty, but in the way love keeps what it treasures most. Forever was no longer a promise. It was the life they lived each day, side by side, on the land that had tested them and bound them together. And when the night grew quiet and the stars stretched across the sky, their story lived on, carried by the wind across the open plains, where whispers and smiles had once begun something that would never end.